Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give everybody a couple minutes to log in and we'll get started. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us in our webinar, The Prison to Deportation Pipeline, Crimmigration and Black Immigrants. My name is Carla McAnders and I teach at Vanderbilt Law School where I direct the Immigration Clinic. We have a really engaging panel today where we will be exploring how immigration enforcement operates absent many of the protections available in the criminal justice system, which results in the heightened detention and surveillance of Black immigrants. Panelists will discuss how the 1996 immigration laws, expanded the crimes for which a non-citizen can be deported, which has disproportionately impacted the detention and deportation of immigrants of African descent. This reality has resulted in an inordinate harm and suffering of Black immigrants and asylum seekers in the United States. We have a diverse panel today that is going to present from various perspectives, from lawyers to academics to on-the-ground activism. So that we can delve into content, I'll briefly introduce you to our panelists and invite you to explore and look at their biographies on the American Bar Association's website. In order of presentation, our panelists first will be Rebecca Sharpless, who teaches at the University of Miami School of Law, where she directs the Immigration Clinic. Next, we'll have Dean Kevin Johnson, who teaches at UC Davis School of Law and is a leading scholar in the area of race and immigration. Then we'll have Hule Cham, who is the president of the Mauitanian Human Rights Network, present, and then followed by Kyle Bashir with the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition. As our speakers present, I invite you to place any questions you have in the Q&A chat box for our panelists. After our panelists have concluded their presentations, we will go into a Q&A session where we will field your questions. Now I'll turn it over to Rebecca Sharpless. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you, Tanisha and Bridget, for putting together this terrific webinar and helping to shine a light on something that usually is not front and center in these discussions. So I'm going to be focusing my presentation on a few themes. Generally, I'm going to be talking about the apparatus that has evolved around mass deportation. How is it that we've come to a place where we deport approximately 400,000 people a year and have held up to 50,000 at any given time in detention? How did we come to this place? I'll be talking about the legal, policy, and cultural shifts, as well as the development of the infrastructure that has been needed to detain and deport such a massive, absolutely massive number of people. I'll be talking about the jail to deportation pipeline, the disparate impact that these policies have on Black immigrants, and then I hope to tell a story that sort of makes real for everyone how this sort of plays out in the real world. Okay, if we could go to the next slide. So this slide, which is from the IIRIRA Institute, I think is helpful. It shows the gray is showing the incarceration rate in the criminal justice system, which you see had peaked in about 2008, where there was about 650 people per 100,000 incarcerated in the criminal justice system. But then you'll see the population diminishing, coming down in the right direction. In contrast, the sort of orange-brown line is the increase in civil immigration detention, which has been rising. The sort of peak at the top on the right is the coronavirus hitting, which is sort of a scenario that did reduce detention. But in general, it's been rising since 1978, since the 80s, such that until the 90s, there were about 5,000 people only in civil immigration detention. That jumped to about 15,000 in 2000. And then under Obama, it was about 30,000 at any given day of people in civil immigration detention. And then it peaked with the Trump administration. It remains to be seen what the Biden administration will be doing. But I think it's interesting to note that while sort of the society's tolerance for criminal mass incarceration has perhaps peaked and now is moving in the right direction, it is less clear whether that's true with civil immigration detention. Okay, we could go to the next slide. This slide shows the breakdown, also from the IIRIRA Institute, shows the breakdown of sort of who's running the jails where people are being held by ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And you'll see that the vast majority of these jails are run by private prison companies, which I'll talk about as one of the driving forces of why we've seen such mass incarceration in immigration. There's also a large percentage, however, of local jails. So these are county jails or city jails where a locality has opted to enter into a federal contract to contract out their bed space, sometimes because the beds aren't being filled because crime is down, sometimes because they want to make money, and they're contracting out those beds to hold people for ICE. And so when we're talking about civil immigration detention, we're talking about jails that are jails in every sense in the world, of the word. So if we go to the next slide, we have a visual of, this is a somewhat typical sort of setup where you have a common living area, usually with tables and chairs bolted to the floor. You may have a TV sort of out of reach on the wall, not much else. There are cells lining the walls. People sleep in the cells, they eat and live in the common area and maybe get 1 hour a day of exercise, but they spend basically all of their time here. This is a pretty typical detention center scene. It's very much a jail like any other jail. And if we go to the next slide, we can see this would be a typical cell, very small, usually at least 2 people in a small place. Note the open steel toilet in the corner, right? So this is jail. This is like prison. The next slide is a contrast. The next slide shows you what a max criminal cell looks like in Scandinavia. I believe this is from Sweden. I have a kid in another year applying to colleges. Her dorm room will likely look like this cell. So one of the big takeaways is that the US is far way off the charts in terms of not only the number of people it's detaining, both on the criminal and civil side, but also how they're detaining. Okay. All right. All right, so let's go to the next slide. So then how is it that we got here, right? How is it that we're holding tens of thousands of people at any given moment and deporting like over 400,000 people a year? First, we need to look at the sort of origin story of also criminal mass incarceration, which many folks have traced back to the sort of war on crime in the 70s, and then in the 80s, the war on drugs, the sort of use of the criminal justice system to solve society's problems, right? And so you'll see that the increase in the criminal incarceration rate, you know, as I showed in that chart, was also increasing at the same time that civil detention was. And society was sort of buying into the get tough on crime rhetoric that, oh yes, we have to lock people up for long periods of time. And that was sort of spilling over and making people tolerate civil immigration detention as well. At the same time, there was the increase in the infrastructure, right? So the number of beds that could be filled with people being held by ICE. And so you have the phenomenon of the private prison group, right? Who builds a jail just for ICE. so that ICE can fill it with people being detained at and a very high ticket price, right? These are huge money makers. So you have the introduction of the profit motive entering into the picture. And so for the first time, the federal government can just sort of like let capitalism control the demand for detention and then fill those beds. And for a time, there was something called the bed mandate, which was the idea that Congress had funded, I believe it was 30,000 or even more beds at any given moment to be filled. And they were paying for those beds regardless of whether they were filled. And so ICE was instructed to fill those beds by any means possible, which of course led to them just indiscriminately, without priorities, taking people into custody. We could go to the next slide. At the same time, we have the expansion of the deportation net. We have the introduction, and this was tied to drug legislation, of the idea of an aggravated felony, which was not in the original Immigration and Nationality Act, which was added. And then what happened was Congress kept adding crimes to the list of what would qualify as an aggravated felony. So things that in the past wouldn't trigger removal would increasingly trigger removal. And they could actually reach back and use someone's old criminal record and deport the person today. In 1996, we saw, Carla was mentioning this, we saw a big shift in immigration law. This was actually under the Clinton administration. I think something that we tend to forget is that both Republicans and Democrats have dirty hands when it comes to this issue. But under the Clinton administration, there were two pieces of legislation that not only expanded the grounds upon which someone could be deported, but they eliminated a discretionary form of relief, such that if someone was a permanent resident, had a criminal conviction and was being deported, they could apply for make an individualized case that they should remain in the United States before an immigration judge. And the 96 laws, including, yes, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act and the EDPA Act, which was the Terrorism Act, those two acts in tandem, it was like a 1-2 punch, eliminated the defense for someone being removed on a criminal ground and expanded the reasons that someone could be deported. And then most recently, and I think this is a huge factor in the work that I see, there was the increased use of a detainer. A detainer is a piece of paper, sort of a check the box form. It's not a judicial warrant, but it's a form that ICE sends to people, to localities and states who are holding immigrants that they think are amenable to removal, meaning they have done some database searches, sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong, and they think that there's probable cause that the person has a civil immigration violation that subjects them to removal. And they lodge this detainer or hold and ask the locality to hold the person up to 48 hours beyond the close of their criminal custody. So what that means is if somebody's acquitted at trial, they would be nonetheless held still in that jail for the sole purpose of ICE to pick them up and bring them to immigration detention and start removal proceedings against them. And that's sort of the pipeline that people talk about, the jail to deportation pipeline. And this, ensnares many, many people. Someone could be basically driving while undocumented, get pulled over for driving without a license, which in many places is a criminal offense, including Florida. The person then is arrested, brought to the local jail, and then the detainer is placed, so they can't, if they pay bond, they'll just end up in immigration detention. They're basically stuck in criminal jail and then shifted and clicked over to immigration jail. And it's that massive pipeline that is also responsible for the big numbers of people in detention. Obama and Trump administration policies, as I said earlier, we shouldn't kid ourselves, both the Obama and the Trump administrations have really focused on the enforcement side of immigration. Under the Obama administration, there was more tailoring of priorities so that not everyone was ensnared into this pipeline, but it was still a massive system like that. Like I said, he ended up deporting 400,000 people in a year during his administration. And the final piece that I want to talk about is this ICE-AIR, right? ICE-AIR is this office that came into being to coordinate the charter flights that ICE was using to, and still is using, to deport large numbers of people at one time. So in the past, ICE used to just pay commercial air tickets. People would sort of board the flight and be like other passengers, and they would get off, and that would be that. And now we've seen a shift to using very expensive charter flights that involve moving people onto the flight in shackles. I have some pictures later that I'll show you. And it's that sort of use of and growth of the use of charter flights that has also enabled this big shift. Okay, so now if we could turn to the next slide. I want to talk about the impact and the disparate impact. So it is true that right now, Black foreign-born people in the US constitute just 1.3% of the entirety of the US population. But one of the things I'll be emphasizing is that that's a number that's growing and growing at a rate higher than other rates. So how do we get there? So 12.8%, and these are all census numbers, 12.8% of people in the US are Black, and 9% of those are foreign born, okay? But the key thing I wanna emphasize is that 9% of Black people being foreign born is up from 3% in 1980. So this is definitely a group of folks that is increasingly becoming a larger population in the United States. If you go to the next slide. And then this slide shows, well, what percentage of foreign-born people are Black foreign-born people. And so in total, we have 45 million total foreign-born in the United States. 7 to 10% are Black. And that represents a 71% rise in the number of Black immigrants since 2000. And increasingly, that population is made up of immigrants from Africa as opposed to immigrants from the Caribbean. So an increasing number of people who are foreign-born are Black. All right, so let's go to the next slide. And so here's the critical thing, right? So we have 7 to 10%, as I said, of all foreign-born folks are Black, but they make up 20% of those facing deportation on criminal grounds. And this comes actually from an Atlantic article that's very good on this issue, right? So a disproportionate number of Black immigrants are caught up into this deportation machinery that I was talking about earlier. And I know that certainly from my own experience when I go to deportation centers, to detention centers, it's very clear to me that this statistic is true, that there's a definite disparate impact. And why is that? Well, it's because Black people, as we know, are more likely to be stopped, they're more likely to be arrested, more likely to be incarcerated. And so they are at greater risk of being funneled into that jail to deportation pipeline that I was talking about earlier. They're more likely to land into jail and therefore get a detainer placed on them. All right, let's go to the next one. So, okay, so how does this actually sort of play out in a real story? And I wanna warn people that there are a few disturbing images in this next part. So back in 2017, we got a call in Miami that a plane of 92 men and women from Somalia had been just landed at the Miami airport, and people were being transported to one of our local detention centers, and that they had been on the flight. It was a deportation flight, one of those charter flights I was talking about, for 2 days. And it was an aborted flight, meaning it made its way all the way to one stop in Senegal, but then was on the tarmac for over a day, and then was returned to the United States. People were shackled for the entire time. They were in, if we could go to the next slide. So this will show you, this is not a picture of that actual flight, but it shows you, these are the shackles, the types of shackles that were used. It was a 5-point restraint system, and people were in these shackles the entire time and forced to be in a seated position. And what happened was when, I mean, some terrible things happened, right? So as people stood up to try to ask a question, use the bathroom, which by the way, the bathroom stopped working and people had to urinate on themselves. They were pushed down, they were choked, they were put in straitjackets. You know, people had bloody injuries. They were basically beaten down by special ops officers. So what happens is that these charter flights become militarized. So special ops, some people, you know, not even showing their faces, are on these flights to terrorize the people. And then when people started saying, well, you can't keep us here for, like, you've kept us here on the tarmac for 20 hours. Like, you need to let us out. You need to let us to walk around, take our shackles off. People's ankles and wrists were swelling around the metal. And the special ops people just unleashed on them. So it was pretty terrible. The next slide, if we could show that, this is Swift Air, which is one of the charter flights. You see this is a woman boarding the flight. She's in shackles. There used to be a policy of transporting people without shackles, and that shackles were only used if there was an individualized finding that there was a danger, a risk, maybe to security to the officer if the person wasn't shackled, but that shifted. And now we have an across the board shackling policy whenever any detained person goes anywhere, to the doctor, to transfer to a different detention center, or to a flight. The next slide shows how these 5-point restraints work. A person's wrists are tied on a very short chain to their waist. So to eat, they have to bow down to get the food to their mouth. People have to use the bathroom while shackled like this. And so the bathrooms become a mess. They're no fault of the people, just because they're shackled while they're forced to use the restroom. And the leg shackles mean that they can't get a full gait when they walk. So when they're walking, they're shuffling. Okay, if we go to the next slide, this is the men who were in straitjackets on the flight described something like this. They called it a burrito wrap. This is a straitjacket. And so part of the force that was deployed by the special ops was a straitjacket like this. Okay, and this is the more troubling pictures. This is, Saeed was one of the group of 92, and he's one of the protagonists that's going to be in a book I'm writing about these men and women and their experiences. And he has generously been very brave and said he wants his story told. This is a picture of him when we met with him. He was in isolation after being pepper sprayed at a local county jail where he was being held in Florida. And they would not remove the cuffs, even though we were there. I was there with a doctor and we were his attorneys. They would not remove the cuffs while we talked with him because he was in isolation. And this is the same kind of restraint that he was on in the plane. And then the next photo shows his hand, his pinky finger was basically ruined. He had had a prior operation on it. And then when he was abused on the flight, it became re-injured. And he was in detention for a very long time. And he never, despite our efforts, and he had an amazing immigration lawyer from the Broward Legal Aid, Andrea Montagon McKillop. Despite her efforts, he never got the operation that he needed while he was in ICE detention. That's another part of this story. But eventually he won his case. He got what's called a refugee waiver, and he was released, and he finally did get an operation. So I want to leave with, on a happy note. The next slide shows Saeed with his kids, 2 of his kids. So I guess I want to say that this is hard work. It's necessary work. And there is hope. Sometimes, you know, it may be incremental progress along the way, but there is progress. And I'm thrilled that the ABA has, like I say, shown a spotlight on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me be here today. Again, I'm Kevin Johnson from the University of California, Davis. I'm very pleased to be able to talk on this American Bar Association panel about some very important topics. I want to build a little bit on Professor Sharpless's insightful presentation, and I want to highlight a couple points, and then I want to give you a sort of a case study into how the criminal justice system feeds into the federal removal system. And I think it's important to remember that for purposes of removal of immigrants from the United States, the state criminal justice system is the primary feeder for that system. Convictions, arrests in state and local jurisdictions are the bread and butter of the federal removal system. And it's not necessarily convictions that can get you removed, arrests can get you removed. It's not necessarily major crimes or serious crimes that get you removed. It could be minor crimes that get you removed. And when I'm speaking of minor crimes, there's a case that I worked on a few years ago involving a woman who was undocumented, who was arrested for selling tamales outside of Target to support her kids, and was facing removal from the country. And besides not focusing necessarily on serious or major crimes, it's important to remember that not only undocumented immigrants are subject to removal. Many times, in the case I'll tell you about, lawful permanent residents who have lived in the United States for many years, including some since they were children, can be subject to removal for a criminal conviction. Now, if the state justice systems feed into the federal removal system, then we should be worried. And you might think, why is that? Well, we know, and we've had a vigorous public debate over the last year about the disparate impacts of the criminal justice system on people of color in the United States. And if you have a justice system that doesn't function well when it comes to race, and that system feeds into the federal removal system, you can expect that the federal removals will have a racial taint to them. And historically, that's exactly what we see. The criminal removal provisions often were passed in response to immigrant groups who were disfavored, beginning with the Chinese, but now extending to many other groups. And during President Obama's administration, about 90% of the people removed every year were Latino. And that's because African Americans and Latinos are the focal point of our criminal justice system. Black immigrants were at risk as well because they may be subject to undue focus by the police. In the Obama years, Jamaicans, for example, were in the top 10 countries of all, the number of all persons removed from the United States. So it's not just a risk for Latino immigrants, it's a risk for Black immigrants if they come into any kind of contact with the criminal justice system. We don't know yet what the outcomes precisely were for the Trump administration because his administration never released data about the countries that were the subject of the most removals from the United States. They just stopped producing that data. We do know, and this is actually an important number, we do know that 90% of the people, non-citizens removed during the Trump years were removed for criminal arrests and convictions. So the criminal justice system really was, as Professor Sharpless said, the deportation pipeline for the federal government. Now, I want to tell you of one case involving a victim of the war on drugs and a long-term lawful permanent resident, and his name is Adrian Moncrief. And his case ended up all the way to the Supreme Court. And immigration professors look at this case as an interesting case involving a very technical interpretation of what an aggravated felony is under the immigration laws. And in some ways, Adrian Moncrief's case is very, very simple. He was arrested and pled guilty to the possession of marijuana for personal use, approximately 2 to 3 cigarettes worth of marijuana. He had lived in the United States since 1984 when he came here as a child. He had 2 US citizen children. He had lived his entire life in this country, been educated in this country, married in this country, and he ultimately faced the prospect of removal from the United States. He was Black, he had dreadlocks. The picture on the police report, which I looked at, makes it clear that he looked Black and he had dreadlocks. Now, the Supreme Court never looked at the police report. The Supreme Court never looked at the criminal conviction. It wasn't part of the record in the case. But in some ways, I think that this case gives you an idea of the risks to Black immigrants of any interactions with the criminal justice system. And I looked at this case. I looked at the police report. I got it from the police department in Perry, Georgia. And I also had correspondence with the officer who made the stop. So I was able to gain some insights that not many people had, really, including the Supreme Court. Now, as Professor Sharpless said, in the last few years, last few decades, really, there's been a war on drugs that has included racial profiling of Blacks and Latinos. Stops for driving while Black and driving while brown are well-known staples of the war on drugs. And when we see the federal government focusing its removal efforts on criminal convictions, we can expect African-American, Black immigrants and Latinos to be the ones who are disproportionately affected. That's what we see exactly in this case, and we see that in a pattern over time of criminal removals. And I want to make one point, and President Obama, when he was president, said that in their criminal removal efforts, his administration was focusing on gangbangers and people who really should be deported. That really isn't true. People who were convicted of relatively minor crimes were deported during the Obama years. And studies that have looked at the overall aggregate rates of removals shown that about 75% of the people removed in those years when 300,000 to 400,000 people were removed for relatively minor crimes. That's not to say there aren't some serious offenders who many people would want to deport. It's just to say that that's not all who's being deported. Now, the traffic stop in Adrian Moncrief's case is interesting. In his stop, which led to a conviction, is the only reason that he ended up in removal proceedings. He lived an uneventful life in the United States, a peaceful life without a criminal record. Let's look at that traffic stop. In 2006, it was a summer night, a police officer pulled Moncrief over as Moncrief was driving along the Interstate 75, the main artery on the East Coast that includes a stretch extending from Georgia to Florida. At various times, we know from the public record, there have been claims of racial profiling along Interstate 75. That weekend, Adrian Moncrief said that he was visiting his daughter in Atlanta. He lived in Palm Beach, and he drove from Palm Beach to Atlanta. And when he was pulled over, he was on his way back to Palm Beach after a weekend with his daughter. On that evening, at the end of the weekend, an officer pulled over Moncrief as he was driving south on the interstate. He was driving a black Chevrolet Tahoe, and he wasn't speeding, according to the police report. He was in his lane, according to the police report, but he was stopped, according to the officer, because of the dark tinting on his vehicle's windows. And the officers thought that this might violate Georgia law. Now it was 11:15 at night, so it's hard to say how the officer could judge the tinting at that point. But the officer later wrote to me and said this, quote, "I particularly like the tint violation as a reason for stopping folks because it negates the argument that I stopped a particular sex or race." That's the end of the quote. So it's clear that the officer didn't want to be tagged with racial profiling and wanted to have a reason for a stop, some would say a pretext for a stop, that didn't rely on race. The officer went to the car window, window rolled down, and later the officer wrote in the police report that he, quote, made contact with 2 BMs inside the vehicle. BMs, he later explained to me, were black males. He relied on a tint violation, and then he thought it was worth mentioning in a police report that it was 2 BMs that he had come into contact with. Then he didn't notice anything illegal, but he made a number of observations. He thought that there were too many air fresheners in the car, including some air fresheners in the back seat. He thought the air fresheners on the mirror in the back seat were kind of odd. Moncrief also had a passenger with him, Kenyatta Robinson, and he was in his 20s. Moncrief was in his 30s at the time, and the police report said that the officer was suspicious of Moncrief's statement that he was friends with Robinson because Moncrief was several years older than Robinson. Another factor mentioned in the police report was the officer thought that Moncrief had too much luggage for a weekend in Atlanta. I don't know about you, but when I travel with my family, I often think that everybody has too much luggage and think twice about it. The officer also, and all these things are in the police report, officer also wrote that he thought it was odd that Moncrief was bringing a friend to visit his daughter in Atlanta. It was a long drive and maybe Moncrief wanted company on the trip. Now, at some point, the officer believed that he smelled marijuana. He didn't initially smell it, but after he talked to the passengers, he thought he smelled marijuana in the vehicle. And he asked Moncrief and the passenger if they had smoked marijuana. And Moncrief admitted he had smoked some earlier in the day. And then the officer decided to search Moncrief, couldn't find anything, but still proceeded. It just happened, I guess, but there was a police dog known as K9 Rex, along with the officer as he was monitoring the interstate. And the officer brought the K9 Rex to the vehicle to search for drugs. The dog alerted, and then there was a search of the vehicle after the dog alerted. And the officer found the equivalent of 2 to 3 marijuana cigarettes in the vehicle. He also found a wallet that included about $1,000 that he said was bundled in a way that he had seen bundled by drug traffickers in the past. In the end, Moncrief was arrested, and he was arrested for possession of marijuana under Georgia law. And if you look at the stop and you look at the search, there are an awful lot of suggestions that this was just another step or another stop in the war on drugs. You got an officer monitoring the interstate with a canine dog who stopped somebody on a ground that certainly isn't serious and is hard to question. You have the officer making it clear in the report that it was significant to him that there were 2 BMs in the vehicle. And then you have an eventual arrest that has nothing to do with the original stop, the window tint violation. And you have a series of factors that point in all kinds of weird directions about whether any unlawful activity is afoot. The officer thought there's something was, but they seemed pretty innocuous to most observers. Now, in the end, Moncrief's initial encounter with the officer was due to a traffic stop that had nothing to do with the drug offense for that he was later charged. But still, he ended up getting charged. He went to court. He basically pled guilty to probation, and he was released. Seems rather simple from a criminal justice perspective, but from an immigration's perspective, that criminal conviction was classified under the immigration statute as an aggravated felony, which subjects somebody to mandatory detention and mandatory removal from the United States with a very limited judicial review. And that's what eventually came all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court didn't have in the record anything about the traffic stop, not much about the criminal conviction, and certainly not the police report. But the question before the Supreme Court was whether possession of a small amount of marijuana could be an aggravated felony, subjecting a non-citizen, a lawful permanent resident, to removal and in effect permanent banishment from the United States. In the last few years, there have been a series of cases like this where relatively minor crimes that under the immigration laws have been characterized by the US government as aggravated felonies have been reversed by the US Supreme Court, sometimes involving a small amount of prescription drugs, in this case, involving a small amount of marijuana. In the end, and this is actually not fully descriptive of all that happened, because I didn't tell you that Moncrief, after the US government started removal proceedings against him, they placed him in detention. They took him away from his family. He lost in the immigration court. He lost in the Board of Immigration Appeals. He's in detention this whole time, and he's facing a removal from the only country really that he ever knew, to Jamaica, which at this point he doesn't really know, because he had a relatively small amount of marijuana. Now, the Supreme Court, in looking at the immigration aspects of the case, and I won't get into the technical details of that, but the court, in a 7-2 majority and an opinion written by Justice Sotomayor, held that this marijuana conviction wasn't an aggravated felony. The statute was very broad, included possession of small amounts of marijuana as well as large amounts of marijuana, and that wasn't sufficient to justify removal of Moncrief from the United States. So in some ways, he dodged a bullet. Justices Alito and Justice Thomas dissented from the opinion. But I think it's important to remember that in some ways, Adrian Moncrief was very lucky. In some ways, he's the tip of the iceberg. Many non-citizens aren't able to obtain counsel to fight their removal. Immigration removal proceedings remove very quickly at times. Immigration removals based on criminal convictions fall disproportionately on communities of color. And oftentimes, there are very little or very few defenders in the political process, as well as the legal process of what are known as criminal aliens. So it's an issue that I don't think is going away. I would hope that at some point we see some kind of reform of the criminal provisions of the immigration laws to make them more sensible in a variety of ways that would allow immigration judges and others to exercise some kind of discretion in deciding who to deport and who to allow to remain in the United States, as opposed to the very drastic, some would say draconian measures taken in 1996 immigration reforms and pursued with a literal vengeance by presidential administrations since then. Let me stop there, and I look forward to your questions in the Q&A session. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Hulay Tiam, and I am the president of the Mauritanian Network for Human Rights. I would like to thank the AVA, Tanisha and her team for making this possible. I'm really glad to be here. I'm honored to be able to tell the story of Mauritanians in the US and what my community organization does on the ground. A little bit of background, Mauritania is located in Northwest Africa. And usually when I say between Senegal and Morocco, people have an idea of where it is, even if they've never heard of the country. Mauritania has suffered through a whole host of human rights abuse. It's a former French colony, and we got our independence in 1960. There is two major ethnic groups in the country. There are the lighter skinned Arabs, also called the Berbers, and there are what we call the Hartanis, which are the former slaves. There are also Black but speak Arabic, and there are the traditional African Mauritanians, we would call them, that are the Fulanis, the Wolofs, the Soninkes, which are African ethnic groups that live in Mauritania. From the 1960s to this day, the power has been held by one ethnic group, which is again, the Moors or the lighter skinned Mauritanians. And most of the wealth is in their hands. They own every bank. Most of the government is in their hands. They do hire Black Mauritanians to do the coloring, we would say, but most of the power and the wealth is in their hands. From the 1980s through now, again, the Black Mauritanians have suffered a lot of human rights abuse. In the 80s, they suffered imprisonment where Black Mauritanians wrote a book talking about the human rights abuse in the country, including my dad, who was held for 4 years simply because he wrote a book describing what was going on. In the 90s, Black Mauritanians suffered a lot of killings, especially people that were in the army, Black officers, got taken away and never came home. In the mid-90s, we suffered deportations of Black Mauritanians, where mostly Fulani Mauritanians were taken from Mauritania, deported to neighboring countries, mostly Senegal and Mali. About 120,000 Mauritanians were deported. And then in 2011, we have what we called the administrative genocide, where the government stated they were going to do a census. It sounds very innocent when you say census, but it's beyond that, where a lot of Mauritanians were stripped of their nationality. They created a lot of stateless Black Mauritanians who to this day can't get official documents such as IDs, birth certificates, and things like that. So there has been a lot of human rights abuse in Mauritania, basically from the independence to this day, but mostly it got accelerated in the 80s and the 90s, and this is still going on. And yes, there is still slavery in some parts of Mauritania. No, not every Black Mauritanian is a slave, but there is still slavery to this day in this 21st century in some parts of Mauritania. So that's mostly why Mauritanians leave. Of course, in the great wars of Worcestershire, you don't leave home unless home is the mouth of a shark. I always say this, most of the time when people leave home, it's not because they want to go on an adventure. People don't just wake up, leave family behind, sometimes wives, sometimes children, sometimes mom, sometimes dad, sometimes child friends, to start in a whole new country with a new culture, new language. Often in adulthood, just because you want to do that. Oftentimes when people leave, there's a very good reason why you leave. And if, in the case of Black Mauritanians, it is because they are running away from something that's bigger than themselves, which has been this abuse, this constant mistreatment of Black Mauritanians on a daily basis, and almost always. The organization I'm leading, the Mauritanian Network for Human Rights, got created in 2018, and it was in the heat of the Mauritanian deportation crisis. Again, Mauritanians started coming here in the early 2000s, mostly. They settled in Ohio. We haven't seen a lot of deportations in my community, although some people did lose their asylum claims, because the human rights abuse in Mauritania is very well researched by the State Department. So as a result, most Mauritanians were not getting deported until Trump came into power And of course, we got our part, and Mauritanians started getting rounded up and put in charter planes, like the sister was saying earlier, and being deported. An example that really, really bothered me was an 8-month-old, a woman who was 8 months pregnant with 2 U.S. citizen kids. Her husband went through an ICE check-in and never came out. He got first detained, and from that, he got deported. He was the sole breadwinner of that family, and she was basically left trying to find help on how she's going to survive without her husband and having 2 young children, of course, in the family. That's just one example of how horrible it was with the fear and the detentions of people coming into ICE check-ins and never coming out. So as a community, we had to really find ways to organize. Most of the time when we organized before, we were looking at how we can change things back home, because we are laser focused on why we left. But from 2018, we really had to think about organizing here, because we saw that there were needs here. And while we appreciated the help of everyone who came to support us in our struggle, Mauritanians had to be at the forefront of this struggle. As a result, we created the Mauritanian Network for Human Rights. And we started to tell Americans and Ohioans mostly that we are here. There's an estimated of about 3,000 Mauritanians in Columbus alone, and then another 3,000 in Cincinnati. But oftentimes people don't even know we're here, and we are here in big numbers. So we started to reach out to our neighbors first, to let them know what was going on in our country, with our families and our community. But also we started to reach out to congressional officers, letting them know that there are Mauritanians here. And yes, while some don't have papers and can't vote, there are Mauritanians who are US citizens. And if you want our vote, you have to know our story. You have to know why we left. You have to know that we're here, and you have to know our needs. So we reached out since 2018 to this day. We reached out to 5 congressional officers, again in every district where Mauritanians were, to let them know that we were here and we were what we wanted in exchange for our votes. And earlier I stated that most Mauritanians came in the early 2000s, but lately what we have seen is a new trend of Mauritanians coming into South America, where they would fly into Brazil, like walk basically, or use any means of transportation to those 10, 12 countries, get to Mexico, cross in from Mexico, and then of course immediately get detained by ICE. And once they get detained, they are trying to find help. As a result, they reach out to my organization. So with that, since the organization got created, we have helped 25 Black Mauritanians get out of detention. We've helped people with about 80,000 worth of bail funds. Of course, this is not us paying for the bail funds. We're connecting them to different organizations that could help them. We've done hours and hours of translation service with their lawyers, because if you're representing someone and you can't communicate with them, there's no help with that. So as a result, we are that middleman or middle organization between the lawyer and the detainee, to be able to allow them to communicate in the local languages. And we've assisted people get sponsors and be able to, again, find pro bono, low bono lawyers. We've also talked a lot about universal representation, because again, as we know, and as a lawyer said earlier, she mentioned this, most immigrants who are in detention don't have an appointed lawyer. You have to find one on your own, you have to pay for it, or you have to find a pro bono or low bono lawyer. But in criminal court, if you kill someone, at least you have a public defender. So universal representation is huge. If we're saying we are this country of great values, where everyone gets a chance, everyone has a chance, and people can come here for freedom, we don't expect someone who doesn't speak the language to be able to defend himself in a cell, or after being months in jail. So being able to appoint a lawyer for someone is definitely giving them a standing chance in this very complicated asylum system. We've also assisted our community members a lot during the COVID-19 crisis. I mean, it's still going on, but at the beginning, it was very hard for people to even understand what it was. So we decided to do a lot of PSAs, where we completed we completed PSA audio format, PSA audios where we spread it out in the community in people's languages to explain what COVID-19 was, how to prevent it from happening to you or your family, and to be able to really learn what it is to safeguard yourself and your family. We assist people with asylum applications as much as possible. We assist people in the census 2020. We did audio format, again, audios to be able to assist family members who were able to, who wanted to fill out the census to be able to do that, to explain to them exactly what the census was and why that was important. We do also make sure we are connected to our community members by doing what we call a tri-monthly community call, where we're able to call everyone in my community on a conference call to be able to listen to what people had to say, but to also let them know what we were able to accomplish in the last 3 months and how, what the challenges we faced were, and really listen to what people had to say and their opinions to be able to incorporate that. What we want to do is to be able to keep in touch with the larger community, to be able to get their input, to be able, because if we're standing for the community, we have to be able to listen to the community. Telling our story is a secret to survival. It is important for Mauritanians to be able, again, to be at the forefront of this fight, to be able to tell the stories, to be able to empower our community members, to let them know, to let the world know that we're here and why we left. Having a very complicated asylum system, I feel like our organization has been a lifeline for a lot of Mauritanian individuals who are detained or who've been living here for years but still cannot be able to get status, who are at least able to get a work permit and a social security, to be able to navigate the system, to be able to find lawyers, to be able to find translators, to be able to just give people the resources that they need to be able to, again, live here safely, navigate the system, and deal with the stresses of life. I'll stop here for now. If there are any other questions, I'll come back. Thank you.
Hey, Holly, thank you very much. And I'm definitely honored to be presenting right after you, actually. So, I won't take too much time. I'll go ahead and get started. I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about definitely resonates with what you just touched on. So my name is Kai Bashir, and I'm originally from Oromia, which is an ethnic group in Ethiopia. But just like many other people, had to flee to Kenya and came to the United States as a refugee about 15 years ago. Currently, I am a multicultural organizer here at the Tennessee Immigrants and Refugee Rights Coalition, which is a member-led organization that I've been a member for about 4 years, and 2 years as a full-time staff member. And prior to that, I had a fellowship to work at the Tennessee Justice Center right after I graduated, where I had the opportunity to assist Tennesseans, navigate the complex healthcare system that we have down here in the South, and then, at Turk, our mission is to empower and equip and immigrants and refugee communities by, highlighting their contribution to our country while also working to build and wield this political power that we have, So, we work to pretty much across the board work to protect Tennessee immigrants communities by organizing immigrants, defending immigration, expanding existing channels to migrate, stopping harmful policies from passing at all levels of government, federal, local, and then working to overturn many of these laws that are attacking our communities, especially here in Tennessee, where there's just so much anti-immigrant, anti-refugee rhetoric that's going on in our communities, but then also within our legislators. So I've been, today invited to be part of this, exciting panel to have a conversation about how equal protection for Black immigrants has failed, and most importantly, steps that we can take to change this course going forward. I think we are living in a new era, a new time, and think how can we take advantage of this? So I'm really excited and honored to be part of this panel with experts in the field of immigration law, and continuing to do this exceptional work. And this is a field that I hope to pursue in the near future. So listening to Professor Kevin and Professor Sharpless, I think I was really excited about that. So today I'm not here to talk about the law or what Kevin and Sharpless, Professor Sharpless talked about, but instead bringing it home, and talking about the real life struggles of our communities and the implications that Professor Sharpless and Kevin touched on how we as Black immigrants at every step of our immigration journey continue to suffer, and are left behind. So I want to bring this home, like our sister Harley just did. I will discuss the resource desert for Black immigrants, especially here in the South, and finally how we as lawyers and advocates that are on this panel and the viewers can be more intentional when it comes to volunteering our time and contributing to this immigration justice movement that we are in right now. So I'm great. So, personally, I'm very grateful for, the journey to the U.S. and all the agencies that helped me along the way and my family to come to the U.S., and then today I have the pleasure of advocating and representing a large base of immigrants and refugees across Tennessee, and having the opportunity to use my platform to highlight the obstacles of being Black in every part of the immigration journey. So yeah, I've had the pleasure of organizing Black immigrants, mainly from the continent of Africa and the Caribbeans. And most recently, I was able to establish the Black Immigrant Coalition, which is a group of Black immigrants from across Tennessee, which is something that I've not seen done anywhere else. Of course, compared, we have groups like Baji, for example, but for example, that are doing some of the great work, but creating this small group that are pioneering, something new for our Black immigrant communities and creating a coalition of Black immigrant leaders to join, this mission that's dedicated to advancing Black immigrant issues in all spaces of Tennessee. So being an immigrant in general is not easy, because there are many barriers and obstacles that, many families, including mine, had to overcome. These include cultural immersion and training. We come from a country where the system is different, the language is different, and then coming to a country like this where it's the land of the free, but accessing a lot of these resources is very hard. And then of course being Black in the USA just adds it all up together. So whenever I'm referring to the cultural immersion, I'm referring to, for example, our parents speaking, my dad, for example, speaks about 5 languages, but coming to the country, coming here and having to learn English is completely different, especially at his age, of somebody that's above 50, so, and then individuals like myself, when I came, I'm 25 now, but came when I was about 11, having her learned British English back in Kenya, but then coming here to relearn English or American English at a young age, and having issues navigating that and all of that, so so there's, of course, language access and lack of translations is very limited. Many of our parents, are having challenges converting their degrees. They were experts back home, but now are working as quote unquote essential workers, the new term that we've came up with after this COVID era. And then furthermore, cultural practices such as how we communicate and discipline our kids is very different, and another challenge for a lot of our communities. So bringing, being Black also meant, you're categorized with many other groups and treated as such. And so I have to navigate being Black in America and then dealing with the legal system, as the other 2 professors touched on, and, immigration and criminal law for Black immigrants is therefore heightened, because you are now a Black immigrant, not educated on the legal system, and then living in a country that continues to draw more red tapes for Black individuals, so now you're again Black immigrant, and then navigating this complex new world with very, very limited resources. Tennessee and many parts of the world, or at least in the country, is especially for Black immigrant is a resource desert. We as Black immigrants do not have many places where we can go to seek assistance, so finding community resources, services, and spaces that our communities can use is very, very hard. These services, if you think about education or health and other social services, including immigration and legal services, in many cases, it's done on volunteer basis, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But many compared to many other communities that have access to these resources because of them coming from a larger community that speaks, for example, one language, referring to like the Latinos, but also because many come from a more favored and well-funded communities. So and then furthermore, the intersection of immigration and criminal law for Black immigrants is a conversation that, in my opinion, has not been given the attention that it deserves, especially immigration enforcement of Black immigrants and how this leads to criminalization of our communities, like Professor Kevin was touching on, so mostly, again, coming from how we as Black immigrants are perceived, and then the cultural immersions that we have to overcome, and then, of course, the lack of resources that are available to Black immigrants once we're caught up with all these struggles, so maybe I can just discuss specifically some of the issues that I had to navigate in my communities. I work mostly with with a lot of leaders in the Black communities. Even though my work allows me to work with all immigrants across Tennessee, my working time is spent mainly assisting many people from Somali communities, Eritrean communities, Oromo communities, and the Ethiopian communities. There is a saying that it's not about what you know, but instead who you know. In many cases, that's true, but in many cases, some people may not be certain about that. But this is very true when it comes to if you're going to get assistance or get assistance or not in communities where we're in. So only a handful of us are in positions of leadership in our communities and in spaces of power. So for me, currently, I am working as a multicultural organizer at Turk, but then I'm also part of the mayor's office of New Americans here in Nashville. And then also may have capacity outside of my work hours to be able to assist a lot of my communities. So getting into these positions as a leader is already difficult because many of the institutions are not intentional when it comes to hiring a more diverse staff. So orgs like mine and many others have very little Black representation. And the few of us that do get a chance to work, for the mayor's office and these other large orgs are the ones that would maybe not have enough capacity, but really have the knowledge and position to help members from these large communities that we come from, because these are the places where we get these resources. So many of us are voluntarily serving and connecting our communities with the resources that other communities have easy access to, like Sister Howley just was referring to. And then access to these resources, these communities need to know me and the other few Black leaders in positions of influence to be really assisted. So if they don't know me, then enrolling their kids in school and how to navigate that, or finding a lawyer for their legal issues and navigating the immigration systems is very, very complicated. And I think this is going to show that we need to put more effort in our institution, our organizations, to make sure that we have a very diverse group of people, because we are the ones in many cases that are a lifeline. So when Black Lives Matter and Black and brown leaders are asking for equal representation, especially in positions of power at these institutions, it's because many of these, in many cases, it's a matter of life and death for their communities. In these spaces that we as leaders are able to advocate, locate resources and almost have the ability to share widely with our community members, which they may have difficulty reaching if they didn't have it come from somebody they trust. So me currently being part of the mayor's office of New Americans, working with the largest immigrant and refugee group, I'm able to assist and advise a lot of individuals in my communities. So I have found myself, helping individuals with citizenship applications, answering general immigration questions, navigating the complex healthcare system, and referring members to other friends that I have in these other large institutions in the area. And I'm doing all of this with a simple undergraduate degree and just connections with agencies in Tennessee, and with a passion to support my community. So they're about in total, I can honestly say that I don't know somebody that knows as many people as I do in Tennessee, but there's literally about 5 of us that are doing all of this work and carrying this burden on a daily volunteer basis. So I really want to give a good example of having these individuals in these spaces like myself. And a good example that I had was, importance of community members knowing one of us. And, is that, last year there was a Ethiopian family that, reached out to the Ethiopian community, which is called the Ethiopian Community Association of Nashville. And a family had reached out to us. It was two Ethiopian parents of three kids that were arrested for child abuse. Of course, disciplining kids from, comes in all forms and shapes. But in our community, hitting a child is almost very normal. So for this family, was arrested. So I remember the dad got arrested first, and then the mom got arrested. And someone from the community reached out to ECAN, which is a local organization that has been established for about 10 years, and that was able to organize, hire a lawyer, and fundraise money as fast as possible to reunify, these parents with their children. The family, are now free of charges. However, ECAN at the moment was able to leverage its resources and its connections to, for example, my organization to find, connect with the lawyer at our office, to connect with the public defender's office. And then, even though the lawyer was overloaded with the case, with his cases, he was able to take on this case, and then after that, ECAN also was able to organize over 300 community members to attend the court hearing, and flood the floors of the courts to pretty much show up for the family, and their purpose of doing this was to show that the family were very connected to the community and to show the impact that they had on the community, and that this action of them being arrested and taken away from their children had ravaged the entire community because everyone was shocked, So because of these efforts, the court was, of course, overwhelmed by all these of all those people that were flooding the halls. And the first thing that they did was drop the bail amount from 40,000 to 5,000. This is huge, pretty big for a poor family like that by simply knowing organizations like ECAN was able to save an entire family. So knowing ECAN and Abi, who is another guy that I work with closely, we were able to save this family and save them, a lot of money and also jail time. But on the reverse, another story that I really wanted to share is this time is from, and not as lucky, is that of a new growing community here in Tennessee, and one of our members. So Pastor Jay is a Congolese refugee that lives here in Tennessee. I think Congolese community is one of the largest growing populations here in Tennessee. I've met him through, one of my organizing work here in Middle Tennessee. And, a few weeks after we had connected, I was able to present at his church about my org and how he should definitely engage his community into our work. But a few weeks later, he called me because his son was shot and killed and needed assistance to find a lawyer or someone that can help him navigate his 15-year-old son's murder case. So his son, who one night at around 7 p.m. went out to practice driving with a 17-year-old friend in the middle of, the back streets of their house in their neighborhood, never returned home. According to the 17-year-old, a white man with a gun stood in the middle of the street and started firing bullets while they were driving. Seems like a movie scene, but the son who was driving at the time tried to drive around him, the individual, and ended up catching a bullet to the head, and the man ended up fleeing the scene. The father, at the time, who was a school janitor and a father to other children, had to sorely balance being a father and navigating his son's case. He would go to the police department to get updates just to be sent elsewhere. And so after running in so many circles, he reached out to me to see if I had any connections with the DA office in that area, and I spoke to, one of our lawyers that's in a different district, and she too said, I don't have any connections with the lawyers in that district. So, the father was almost left alone to fight his son's case because he can't afford to do much, So I think what happened here is two things. One, he didn't have the community knowledge on the networks like the previous family that was able to connect with ECAN. ECAN has been here. The Ethiopian community has been established for about 10 years. This Congolese community has been here for about less than 2 to 3 years. So they don't have that institution here that can mobilize a group of people to take actions like ECAN did. And then the other one is that they lack the space that they can go to that has resources to support, a family like his, so, in the state of Tennessee and across the country, we find that immigration resources may be available, but not to Black immigrants, especially here in Nashville. Access to resources is limited to individuals like myself that work predominantly in white or Latino establishments like the Tennessee Justice Center, the Tennessee Immigrants and Refugee Rights Coalition. And my organization has been able to be part of defeating many of these anti-immigrant bills and organizing communities to be more empowered. However, many orgs, including mine, just recently started investing in Blacks and Black leaderships. And many others that I work with don't even do that at all. So some of these issues that we face again are, the cultural immersions for Black immigrants communities are very rare, or opportunities to go learn these, and then advocates for these communities almost don't exist. And local leaders like myself, some of these communities are having to volunteer a lot of our own time to support a large base that would otherwise have no one else to turn to, so Black immigrants are, like I mentioned earlier, are facing a resource drought and are left alone to navigate the resource desert here in Tennessee, especially around legal services, legal clinic, and just general immigration questions. And if they don't know anyone, then for lack of better terms, they're shit out of luck, so, many refugee agencies help communities for the first few months, but after that, they're on their own and having to rely on the few of us that are in these positions to navigate that, so let me check my time. Okay, looks like we're good, So yeah, I'm not here to pit different immigrant communities together, but instead, I really wanted to highlight the Black immigrant communities' experiences that are often forgotten, from the shores of Europe to refugee camps in Kenya and here in the United States, so immigration law and, immigration advocacy in general should just be challenged. These two fields do not really represent or cover the diverse nationalities as the name implies, and so we as immigration lawyers, not me, you guys as immigration lawyers and advocates like myself must challenge this notion and truly be more intentional with the work that we do. When we make immigrants of African and Black, just Black immigrants in general, invisible, it leads to this scarcity of resources and opportunities, so many, I think many cards are already stacked against Blacks and Black immigrants. So looking at the many factors, I've discussed and the intersection of criminal law and immigration law, it's obvious that, it has disproportionately impacted Black immigrants, like the previous speakers have talked about, the most simply for being, overlooked population with limited resources. So when the examples given by Professor Sharpless and Kevin, it shows that the lack of Black institutions of finding for such groups to do these advocacy works for us. So when we have an opportunity to advocate, we need to also challenge, for example, the notion of the African ban and who all are immigrants. And because the limit of the narrative allows for many immigrants to become more vulnerable and susceptible to racism in the U.S. through the immigration system. So U.S. immigration laws are, as we know, have historically operated to prevent many poor and working people of color from migrating to the U.S. by imposing rules like the public charge that Trump came in with, and the wealth test to exclude those from poor and Black communities, and make America, as I heard in one time, the white paradise that they have long so wanted. And it's really unfortunate. So with the new administration, I was very hopeful, but looking at many of Biden's early immigration orders, they have largely been limited to reviewing, but not really undoing those Trump policies, especially when you see what he has done with repealing policies that impact people and hiring people that look like me. Since the beginning of all of this, Black immigrants have continued to be deported with no remorse. I think there's a new flight going out to Haiti almost every other day. This shouldn't be a way that we start and end Black History Month, so, the continuous detention and harsh deportations are, of course, sounding alarms for what comes as we fight against the Biden administration's policy that will result in the continued criminalization, exclusion, separation of Black people, including Black immigrants, so these systems that seem to create structural inequalities are not, new systems. It's did not start during Obama's era, Biden's era, Trump's era, or Biden's. This is something that's been going on for a long time, and it's not that the systems are the systems designed are not working. It's that they were never intended to work, and meet the needs of Black folks. So our voices, our stories have been exploited, and institutions have used moments like Black History Month to be part of this hype or this part of this conversation, but are not necessarily taking a step back to make real, intentional, systematic change in their own organizations. Their resources, the resources that are currently available in many communities goes pretty much to the squeakiest wheel, the largest population or the widest neighborhood. So for many of these Black immigrants that are just coming and barely trying to settle, they're not able to advocate for themselves like many other people. So therefore, I think it's important that we support the few small organizations such as the ECAN or the Mauitanian group that the sister just talked about, and these local Black organizations, because these are the most marginalized, because it's not that, many of these communities don't have a voice, but instead their voices are just not being heard, so, and if you're a large institution or you're working for some of these huge law firms, I beg you guys to reflect on what population your organization is supporting, the demographics, and how you can be more intentional, engaging and serving, Black immigrants in a way 365 days of the year, and not just the month of February to cross off, Black History Month. So let's see, what's my time looking like? I talk a lot, so I'll continue going until I get cut off. So, I think next thing I really want to talk about was just the roles of institutions, but then also what you all as lawyers and individuals like myself as advocates can do. So, lawyers can, definitely leverage their positions to empower immigrant communities, and also, but at the same time, they also need to. There are steps that individually and institutions can be more intentional when thinking about who and why we help certain communities, and how we can engage those that are missing in our network, in our work. So if I could start, lawyers, we need you all in our communities, very much so. However, as lawyers, as much as we need you all in your support, please also, think about how you can step back and not really and not enforce those power dynamics that, for a long time we've been trying to disrupt. Especially in immigrant communities, that there's a lot of difference given to lawyers. Immigrants more than American-born people think that lawyers have all the answers and should know the question, and should not question their lawyers. It can be very easy for lawyers coming to work with this population or with our populations, and even if they're well-meaning full lawyers, they can come in and enforce this power imbalance. It's really important that lawyers that do this movement work to think about how the interactions either support or fight against the current power structure. Especially if you're a white lawyer, you can come in and save the day, and you can have a real good legal results, but end up being very disempowering to many of our communities. So it seems like, I think lawyers are especially taught to talk with all these lawyerly jargon, and the lawyers are, the ones that can come in and save things. But this is not all, it's not true at all times, in a way that, and in a way that is a way to justify, of course, the expensive law degree. But, it's really important that for movement lawyers to examine how your interaction with clients and communities show up, how they further power the dynamics in theory, so that we have been for a long time trying to disrupt. So increasingly, law is not the answer. It may be part of the answer, but not all. So these legal remedies are usually so far removed that they address just one part of the problem. It's very important that just always realize that to make long-lasting change, it requires, it's a collective effort of lawyers, communities, and organizers to work together. So I think going forward, if lawyers, I really encourage you guys to work with the local organizers in your communities to see how is the best way to approach many of these communities that we have. So doing just legal is not enough, because remembering people's lives is more than just one issue. So I think I can wrap it up there, Carla, and I'll save more time for questions.
Thank you so much for your presentations. There's just so much great information. And now we'll kind of shift. We have about 5 minutes, And we've been fielding questions, but we want to open up the questions to, I'm going to try to group some of our questions together given the time that we have left. And so the first question is for Rebecca and Kevin regarding reforms. Becky, the Biden administration had a pronouncement that they would end private prisons as is related to the criminal legal system. I was wondering, and I think during their campaign, they might have promised to end the private prison system for both criminal and immigration. Can you talk about what the impact of that has and what it signals and what it actually means in terms of reforming the criminal and immigration or crimmigration system? And also we had some questions for just involving reform in general. And so one question is whether, the recommendation, and this is for Kevin and Rebecca, to exchange criminal carve-outs as a currency to achieve immigration reform by way of conservative votes would avoid this cycle. And so I think the main question is, how do we kind of facilitate this larger question of comprehensive immigration reform? And, specifically to Kevin, should we put discretion in the hands of immigration judges who, if we look at kind of how the system has worked, it's not uniform, and we have disparate, decisions coming from immigration judges outside of the criminal, just in general, should we put discretion? So I guess this is me trying to put all the questions together in terms of reform. What does it look like? And, how can we fashion reform to help some of the issues that were brought up today?
Well, I could start in and jump in and say that in talking with some folks I know on the Hill who are now part of the administration, the new administration, I am cautiously optimistic that the baseline has shifted and the conversation has shifted around crimmigration, that the Black Lives Matter movement, the Michelle Alexander's new Jim Crow has become part of the national conversation, has become mainstreamed, and that the way people are talking about crimmigration is so different from when they were talking about the prior legalization programs, where that big carve-out trade-off was a huge problem, and why, in part, advocates were just like, and immigrants are like, we're just walking away from this because there was just so much in there. So I'm hopeful. I also think that there is now a liberal backlash post-Trump, that under the Obama administration, there was more of a sort of ability to try to compromise and talk things out and move forward. But now they're like, oh, gloves are off, right? Trump taught us one thing: we just got to move our agenda, have the courage of our convictions. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I think it's right to be cautious, though, because this is a big beast to move, and the laws, it's not clear how much we could get through the Senate. So I do think that we're going to see those conversations happen again. But I think I'm hoping we are in a different place this time around.
I'm not as optimistic, but I do agree very much with something that Kaio said. If we want to see immigration reform that's meaningful, we need to have continued activism and a pushing of the Democrats as well as the Republicans in Congress to act. One of the wonderful social movements of this century has been, I don't want to call them dreamers because they don't like to be called dreamers all the time now, but undocumented and other people pushing for change and marching and not remaining in the shadows like some people said they were living beforehand. I think that this isn't going to change by being quiet, and it's not going to be lawyers. It's going to be activists who push for change. And I'm not saying push for change in violent ways or anything like that, I just think that this has to be an issue that's on the agenda, that doesn't get pushed off to the second term, that doesn't, there's already some step back in the Biden administration on some areas, like including, not ending private detention and immigration. So I think that everybody who's interested in change, there has to be a full court press and continued organization, and I think that that's going to be critically important to anything coming forward, and to have something principled come forward as opposed to selling out criminal aliens. Put that in quotes, as has happened in the past, saying, oh, maybe I can get rid of the lines on the family immigrant visa, so let's deport more criminals. I think that there really has to be continued activism and pressure from communities that are affected by these laws.
I know we're at time, but we have two more questions. As Kayo and Hule were talking, we were getting lots of questions in the chat box and Q&A box about, what can I do as a lawyer? How can I specifically, support, the Mauritanian Human Rights Network, specifically related to, providing representation? So if you, Kayo and Hule, could give like specific strategies or steps, our audience is, mostly lawyers with the American Bar Association. What can they do, if you're in Tennessee and there's an, desert of resources, what specific steps can people take?
I'll start. Thank you so much again for making this possible. I'm so glad for the opportunity to be here. And with regard to the Mauritanian Network for Human Rights, some of the things we would want for people to help us with is with resources. Again, as Brother Kayo was saying, he kept saying resource desert or desert. I love the idea, just to show that a lot of Black immigration or Black immigrant or community organizations are strained for resources. I have 7 members on my board. We all have full-time jobs. I am on my 1.5-hour break right now that I'm taking to be here right now, to be able to tell my story, to be able to tell the story of my community. And people are doing this for passion, but most of the time, the resources are not there. The time is not there, the money is not there. And we see these big organizations that keep getting highlighted, but the people who are on the ground are doing a lot of the work. I'm not saying they're the only ones are not getting what they need to be supported. So visit our website at themauritaniannetwork.org. You can make a donation. If you're a lawyer, you can email us to be on our list, because we have people in detention right now that need lawyers that we can't find, because again, over the last 4 years, we no longer in our list of low bono or pro bono lawyers have been used, and lawyers are no longer able to do it. They are tired of working for free, and I don't blame them. And that would be one. And the other thing that I would encourage everyone to learn more about is to learn more about Mauritania, to learn more about the Mauritanian story. Again, Mauritania got its independence in 1960. We've had so many different human rights abuse issues. And to this day, still happening, and people will keep coming until the issue is fixed at the root. So learn more about what's going on there, write about it, tell the story, help us shine a light in this, because we feel like it's been kept under wrap for so many years, because the world doesn't even know what's happening. And no government should be allowed to maintain such human rights abuse for so long without anyone saying something about it. We feel like if there's some pressure from the international community, they will be changing Mauritania, and Mauritanians will be able to stay home and remain home and live decently, not having to come here, or to even, especially for the new Mauritanians who are doing that South American journey. It's very dangerous to even do that, because if you don't know the ways, the language, the cultures, crossing 12 countries to come here, it's very, very dangerous for people to do that. So shine a light on the Mauritanian issues, support Mauritanian immigrants here by either donating to organizations that are helping them, or sign up to give services like becoming a lawyer or any of those things. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate that question. I think I'm gonna go ahead and simplify it. So whenever you look at the sister and you look at me, you can't tell I'm from Oromia and she's from Mauritania, you know. So I think just to make it even broader for the audience, I think we have to be very intentional with the work that we do. I think a good example is, like I said, I worked at the Tennessee Justice Center right after I graduated and received a fellowship there as a client advocate. And, you know, when I started, for maybe the first 6 months, about 95% of my cases were white clients. And for me, I had to question that, because I remember my community, we also need services navigating, you know, the teen care and healthcare here. So I spoke with the lawyer that I was working with at the time, and I said, hey, we need to diversify this. We need to start reaching out to a broader community, you know. And in less than 2 months, I ended up going from regular 20 to 30 case caseload to about 95, because I started doing all the Spanish, all the Somali, all the Oromo cases, you know. And I think we as lawyers, and you guys as lawyers and me and as an advocate, need to be more intentional and sit down and reflect about what are the caseloads that we have, and are we really reaching out as broad as we can. And then the second one is really being more intentional with working with local activists in your community. You know, I think there are individuals like me everywhere, but it's going to take time, but just reaching out to those individuals and seeing what do the community need, not what you guys think we need, but what does the community really need. And then finally, you know, support and intentionally start hiring folks that look like me, you know, as advocates, as lawyers, and all of the above, you know. And I think by doing that, we're all going to be able to do this great work that needs to be done. So I appreciate you guys for allowing me to be part of this panel.
I think that is a great way and a call to everyone who is on this webinar to become engaged and participate. So I want to thank all of our panelists for the wealth of information that you've shared with us. And I would like to thank the ABA's Immigration Commission and Tanisha Bowens for spearheading, bringing us together in this conversation, in this webinar. So thank you so much for your participation.